18. The door closed behind them, and left them in the dim, flickering light of what appeared to be some kind of maintenance tunnel, or emergency escape. The walls were rough-hewn rock, the floor as well, though it was mostly flat. Above, a single emergency light flickered on and off with a dull green glow. Medea felt penned in, not just by the walls and closeness of the mildewy smell of the place, but her own mind felt claustrophobic. Was she a great one? An immortal of Raga? Or merely a puppet led by their will? What did it mean that they were the successors of Cormu and Sophie? Suddenly every decision she had ever made felt poisoned by this revelation. Had she decided these things, or had some sick twist of fate compelled her to do them? Some internal force of Sophie forcing her hand? All her life, she had done what she could to protect the ones she loved. Even when it hurt to lose her freedom, and her childhood, she did it because her people, her family, and friends had needed her. But it had always felt like a burden even when she tried to deny it to herself. Always felt like being crushed under the weight of everyone's hopes and expectations. Was this why she hated it? Because it had never been her decision from the beginning. Medea's breathing grew quick and shallow. She began to pace back and forth like a madwoman, clutching at her head. Her fingers touched the rim of the crown. In a rage, she tore it from her head and tossed it across the room with a scream of frustration. It made the sound of a bell as it hit, and then spent a few moments spinning noisily on the ground before falling silent.
Okay, Mom and Dad look a bit angry,
Wild said to herself, though in the small room it was loud enough for all to hear. Medea whipped around and glared at her. She was not in the mood for the brash girl's comments right now. She could feel a biting, bile-filled reply fill her mouth when Fast Joe put up his hands.
I think we should leave you two to talk. We'll be downstairs, whenever you're ready,
he said, then quickly dragged Wild down the next set of stairs and away. Chesney and Medea were left alone, facing away from each other in silence. Chesney, she thought with sudden realization. That feeling between us. Was that just Sophie's pull, or whatever, too? She felt sick, thinking back to how her feelings could have been manipulated, even right at the beginning. The past few days had been so hard. Every glance from him felt like he could see right through her. Every action was delayed because she was second-guessing herself over and over. And for what? To echo the feelings of a long-gone hero. She looked at the crown, feeling hate towards the thing. Was it influencing her too? I prayed to you. Was I always just your toy? Curse me, I even sang that song about you. And then I saw Chesney, and was that just echoes of your feelings for Cormu? Is there anything of mine that isn't from you? I'm such a stupid fool. Take it all back. I don't want anything from you. I don't want to be you. Her parents. Did she even have any? Was she somehow just magicked into this world? Was she Sophie and Cormu's daughter? Their descendant from time immemorial? Or was she not related at all? Was she Laffrey, or Regan? Something in between. A Lubot? Wait, was this why I was kidnapped? Sudden realization dawned. This had to be why. But if that was the case, that her heritage drove Zagos to capture her. How had he known? How did he know when no one else did? But no. Daphne knew too. But how? And when? A hand touched her shoulder. It was Chesney's. For a split second, she felt her mind calm, but in the next, she was filled with revulsion at the reminder that she was a pair, and perhaps the feelings she had felt for him were just another side effect of Sophie's influence. She jumped back and slapped away his hand.
Don't touch me.
Finally, she looked at him. He looked pale and green. His face was a mixture of fear, and revulsion, and despair. His hand hovered in the air for a moment where she had slapped it, then dropped to his side. They spent heartbeats looking into each other's eyes, and seeing their hurt and confusion mirrored back at them. Chesney whispered quietly,
I know you probably want to talk about this as little as I do, But we should, at least so we can clear the air between us.
She noticed he still had the armor of Cormu in his other hand. He hadn't tried to put it on. Seemed to want to be as far away from it as possible. In fact,
what do we even say?
She spat.
What is there to even talk about?
It was another dozen or more heartbeats before he replied.
Yeah. I don't know either.
How could she be expected to tame the thousand swirling emotions and thoughts in her brain? To speak the dozen things she never wanted to be possibly true, but couldn't escape from? Any time she thought of opening her mouth, all she wanted to do was scream. Chetsney tried again.
I guess if I had to sum it up in a word, it would be trapped.
Her turmoil opened enough to realize there was someone else who was feeling the same things she was right now. Probably the only person on the whole planet who could relate to what she was going through. She fought her mixed and spoiled feelings about him, to bridge that gap, just a little.
I just feel so used.
There, she said it. But now that she had broken that barrier, it was like she could feel a flood building inside her. All her feelings of anger, and hurt, and fear were bubbling up, and she wanted to throw them out of her so they would no longer be in her.
Like, I'm spinning in my own head, wondering what decisions were mine, and which were Sophie's. Was I real? Did I even have a choice? How much of my life is a lie? Obviously, Zagos and Daphne knew this. Who else? And how did they know?
Quietly, Chetsney spoke, like he couldn't remember how words were supposed to sound with emotion.
Yeah, I can understand that. When did people know? Like, did my mother know? I never knew my father. What was he? But the thing I can't stop thinking about is how my body suddenly feels like it doesn't belong to me. Like, looking at it makes me feel sick.
Medea hadn't thought of it that way. What must it feel like to suddenly feel like your body no longer belongs to you? Across the room, Chesney wondered what it must feel like to not even trust her own thoughts. The silence between them reigned again, caught between needing comfort but feeling too fragile to give it.
We should just go,
Chesney said, though not moving from where he stood. Medea deflated. All that fiery rage that had been building just left, and now she felt empty and tired, hollow. Grudgingly, she walked to where the crown was on the floor, picked it up, and walked to the door. She didn't put on the crown. He didn't put on the armor. They descended, meeting Wild and Fastjo standing beside a sturdy-looking seafaring vessel that sat in a covered cove of water. Both sides of the spacious cavern let in the blinding light of the sun from openings large enough to allow the passage of the ship. The voyage west was long, lonely, and quiet. Chetsney spent his time focusing on the ship and keeping it stable. Any time there wasn't anything to do, he spent it just watching the cliffs and beaches of Nasquat's coast go past. He didn't say a word, and handled every task himself. Medea, for her part, was basically glued to the part of the ship that was furthest away from everyone, though it wasn't exactly spacious. She just watched the horizon of the ocean, trying to not feel ill as the boat bucked in the ocean waves. Fastjo and Wild felt out of place with the two of them so quiet, but they remained respectfully silent and gave the pair what space they could. Once the sun was an hour or so from setting, they approached the southwesternmost point of Nasquat, where the cave of Daphne had been and sat. It rested there as it had before, on some cliffs, but to the side and below was a beach with a few switchbacks leading up to it. As they climbed the switchbacks, she felt twin spikes of anger and fear at what Daphne would say, and what she would say to Daphne. Anger that there was so much she had kept from her, from them, and fear that there might even be more. As they approached the mouth of the cave, to their shock, they found Luliet there, shaking out a carpet of dirt and dust.
Chesney and Medea. Oh my goodness. Thanks Sophie, you're safe,
she cried, dropping her work and rushing over to embrace them. The four of them cringed at her exclamation about Sophie, but pushed it aside for now. She had no idea, and she didn't mean anything by it.
Luliet, what are you doing all the way out here?
Chesney asked, the first thing he'd said for hours. His voice was dusty.
Oh, well, after you left, I decided I didn't want to spend the end of the world just working at an inn. So I decided to go out on my own little journey. Eventually I caught wind of your journey from a very nice woman in Dover, and decided to see what had happened to you. I found Daphne, and decided if there was anything I could do to help Linus, I'd help her do it.
She smiled, but seemed a bit wistful.
Of course, that mostly just means keeping house here, but I do some other things too.
Media cleared her throat softly, and asked,
Daphne's inside, I take it? Oh yes,
she exclaimed, getting her energy back.
She's been waiting for you. And I was so worried. Imagine sending a few kids down to get all of Cormu's things. It's unconscionable. Well, come along. I'm sure you two have a lot to talk about.
You have no idea. The screaming match began pretty much as soon as the trio locked eyes with each other. Luliette, Wild, Fast Joe, and the other members of Daphne's entourage were all stunned into silence. Luliette seemed especially abashed once she realized what they were talking about, and the implications. Once things calmed down enough, Daphne sat the three of them together at the table, had some tea served, and looked very tiredly across at the two children glowering at her.
Okay, enough. Obviously Joanne, that blabbermouth, talked a lot more than he should have.
She complained.
More than he should have. Are you serious? We should have heard this from you, not him. When were you planning on telling us all this?
Chesney said, standing up in anger and slamming his hands on the table.
Sit down. We'll be at this all day if you keep losing your temper, young man. And it wasn't the right time to tell you then. It's not the right time to tell you now, but the rat's already out of the trap,
she said, waving him down.
Think about it. What would have happened if I told you then? You'd have freaked out. You needed time to accept these things.
Media stared at her tea, not touching it.
You mean we might have said no, and not done what you wanted us to do?
Daphne rubbed her face in frustration.
Yes, and make no mistake, there was no one else who can do it. That's my point. You already knew that it had to be you. The only difference now is, you know why. What does it really change?
It was Media's turn to slap the table.
Everything! It changes everything. I still don't understand myself, but now I feel like I never even had a choice, like I'm some puppet of the past. Young lady, of course you had a choice. Both of you did. You're not them. You're you. Are we? How do you know that? Nobody knows what happened to them, where they went, what they did, or what they can do.
Media's anger gave way to a sob.
How am I? How am I supposed to trust myself? How am I supposed to believe in my own decisions, my own thoughts, and feelings, when I don't even know what I am anymore?
Chesney closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. He was initially looking at his cup of tea in his hands, but put it down and hid his hands under the table where he could no longer see them.
Okay. Cards on the table. Daphne. Simple terms. What are we? You are Regans.
A beat of silence passed.
That's it. Just dragons. Nothing else to add?
Daphne growled.
You said simple terms. That's the simplest true statement I can say. All right then. Next question.
Media said, her voice cold.
What does it mean that we are the successors, or second comings, or advents, or whatever, of Sophie and Cormu? Where did we come from?
Daphne got up from her chair and started rummaging with a bunch of scrolls in a bookshelf nearby.
Well, near as I can tell, it's like... You ever hear how the past repeats itself? Well, this whole Dahlgren song and dance happened before. And it's happening again. They fought then. You're fighting now. Ah, ha ha. Here.
She dragged out a few scrolls and brought them to the table. Unfurling them, she displayed a half-dozen written records.
We don't have much surviving from that time. but they described the great ones, how it felt like to see one, the differences between Regans and the people of Lennis, what they did or could do, that sort of thing. If I were to put it all into words, I would say you are Regans that have some kind of blessing from Sophie and Cormu. Like, someone who is meant to take up their quest. You are not them. You're not their children, either.
If they truly were not the Great Ones reborn, then being their children had been Midia's next fear.
How do you know that, Daphne?
She sighed, burying her face in her hands.
That part, I can't tell you.
The pair of them were about to shout in unison, but she held up a hand.
And no, I can't even tell you why I can't tell you. Soon. Not now. Next question.
For the time being, they stewed in their anger, thinking of what to ask next. Eventually, Daphne was the one to break the silence. Her voice was close, quiet, gentle, and supportive.
Okay. I think there are questions and worries lurking under what you're asking me. You two are both a mess. Here is what I want you to do. One at a time, I want you to tell me what's really, deeply worrying you.
The pair of them looked at each other, then looked away. How could I possibly say that in front of him? Daphne, reading the mood perfectly, said,
Yes, in front of each other. Especially in front of each other. You two are a team, a single fighting force. If you falter, we have nothing. You need to trust in each other utterly. Now, Chesney, I'm sorry to do this to you, but you are going first.
Chesney snuffed a laugh.
Of course, I am meant.
He spent a few moments collecting himself, then started to speak. He didn't look at anyone while he did, just off in the distance, trying to speak his feelings. In spurts, he said,
I guess I just feel like, I don't know, this is all too unfair. Like, this was never my problem, and now I have to fix it. I already felt so much pressure and expectations on me before this. But now, it's like a dozen times worse. Cormu was a legendary hero. What if I can't live up to that? I'm just a kid. And everyone's counting on me to come up with a plan, come up with a way to lead us all to victory. And I catch myself thinking, is this how Cormu felt? And I hate myself for thinking it. Because when I look at myself, it no longer feels like this is my body. Like it's no longer mine, somehow, and feels wrong. And it's his, and I want my own body.
His voice cracked.
What if that feeling never goes away?
Daphne nodded, and opened her palm on the table, looking to take his hand. Eventually, he took it.
That sounds awful. And you're right. Completely. This should never have been your problem. And it's unfair that such a terrible burden has fallen on your shoulders. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. So, for the first problem, the pressure, the expectation, I want you to remember something. Cormu wasn't alone, and neither are you. He didn't do this all himself. He had Sophie, and Gabnid, and who knows who else. Legends are legends. They are made up to sound incredible. Cormu was a single person. And so are you. Lean on your friends, whenever you can, young man. As for your other problem,
she continued,
when that feeling comes over you, I need you to take the time to address it. Don't shove it away, or ignore it. Here's what I want you to do. Midia, take his hands. What?
She exclaimed, jumping back a moment.
Please, just do it, and follow my instructions.
Awkwardly, they turned, and he placed his hands in hers.
The reason I'm doing it like this is because I'm not going to be there. You are. You need to help him with this. Now, just say, you are Chesney. You are right here.
This felt so silly and embarrassing. She stammered.
You are Chesney. You're right here. No, both of you. Look at each other. This isn't a date. You're trying to perform some healing here. Now, again.
Inwardly cringing, she turned her eyes to look into his. He looked like he was trying to keep himself from looking away, instead of a blush, though he did look somewhat ill. She wondered once more just how badly it must feel to feel so out of place within your own body. Stamping down the part of her that felt revulsion at being touched right now, she again repeated the words, more clearly, while looking into his eyes.
Better. Now, Chetsney, repeat it back to yourself. Take breaths.
He did, and she could feel his hands trembling as he took a breath, then said,
I am Chetsney. I am right here. I am Chetsney. I am right here. Good. Exactly. Now, did that help?
He released her hands, and closed his eyes. He still seemed to be somewhat ill.
The feeling has gotten a bit better. It's not all the way gone.
Daphne sighed.
Okay, but a good first step. Both of you, keep an eye on that. Medea, you need to help him with this until he can do it on his own.
She nodded, solemnly.
All right. Now, Medea, I realize I've just dumped some of Chetsney's problems onto you before I even fully understood what is going on with you. And I'm sorry about that. But please, tell me what's really bothering you.
She closed her eyes, holding back the moisture that was building. In a whisper, she said,
Do I have to? Please?
Was all Daphne said. The sincerity there was almost too much to take. She couldn't open her eyes, couldn't face their judgment, or pity, or even acceptance. Not while she said this.
I feel like, I don't know, used, cheapened. Like everything I've done up until now, how hard I've worked, means less. Like, all my successes are because of her, and all my failures are on me. But even beyond all that, I'm worried that...
She hated the crack in her voice. She couldn't stop. Hated feeling weak like this more than anything.
What I'm most worried about is that there isn't a me. That it's all her, and that everything I have, everything I am, all my thoughts and decisions, even my feelings, they're all just a reflection of her, and what she wants or wanted. All my life, I've felt like the only great one I ever wanted to pray to was Sophie, because it felt like she would understand my feelings. And now that I know why, I just feel disgusting. And I can't even trust myself anymore.
There, finally, with everything out there, she opened her eyes, and looked at Daphne. Daphne nodded and took a breath.
Yeah, that's a big one. And, if I'm hearing you right,
she began, looking at Medea keenly. Medea tried hard not to shift her gaze, but she couldn't help but take just a moment to steal a glance at Chetsney. Daphne continued.
Well, I'll be honest, Medea, trying to conquer that level of self-doubt isn't going to be an easy fix either. But you need to remember this just as badly as Chetsney does. You are you. I know you have so many questions about who you are, where you came from, and what everything all means. And I can't say everything now. But what you really need to understand and take into yourself is this. While I am sure you felt pulled or compelled to do certain things because of your Ragan heritage, you ultimately decided to act on them. And how? There were so many other decisions you could have made. You could have not followed Chetsney. You could have not stayed in Hagudo. You could have left your reign to its fate. But you didn't, not because you felt you had to, but because that's what you thought was right. And can you truly say you regret any of those decisions? Regret anything you did? Regret how you feel?
She searched her feelings, and all the choices she had made in their journey. Following Chetsney, helping the Squirrel, helping the people of Hagudo, the dancers, Jirain, taking Wild with them to Sasquatch. Even painful decisions like fighting for the helm of Cormu. In all of it, all she could feel was pride at what she had done so far. Never in her wildest dreams did she imagine in her time as Retzerk's protectress that she would come to leave the town and accomplish so much. How many lives had she saved? But on the other hand, how many had she taken? She looked to Chetsney, searching him for an answer she didn't know. She had followed him, supported him, helped him to become a better leader. And in turn, had he not supported her at every turn? Protecting her, reassuring her, always listening to her thoughts and opinions, confiding in her his most painful moments, making her grow better and stronger every day. None of that could be fake. She gave a wan smile, and looked back to Daphne.
No, I can't say I regret anything I've done.
Daphne let out a large breath, as though she'd been holding it the whole time Medea had been thinking.
Good. Please, never forget that. When you doubt yourselves, confide in each other. You two are the only people who even have an inkling what the other is going through. Make use of that connection.
Chesney swallowed.
So, what now? Did you find a way to track down Kmat?
At last, Daphne stood, and again went to the bookshelf, rummaging around for something. Somehow she looked even weaker. Was this not the hardest conversation they were going to have today?
I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but we're not going after Kmat and Dahlgren yet.
Chesney coughed mid-sip of tea.
Excuse me. What? What could possibly be more important than Kmat and Dahlgren? Who knows what they're doing, but it feels like the world is waiting on the edge of a knife, just waiting for it all to come crashing down. Something just as bad, no, worse, has happened. I'm sure you are both aware of how different Sayasquat is to Nasquat. And the reason, Zagos. What you may not know is that Zagos is not only a master spiritualist, but a brilliant researcher and mechanical engineer.
Chesney leaned over to Medea and whispered,
What's a mechanical engineer?
She shrugged. She'd never heard such a term before. Daphne sighed.
He makes machines. Specifically, he's been trying to recreate as much Reagan technology as he can. Here.
She grabbed a scroll and brought it to the table. She unrolled it. There were many small pieces of paper within. A few scribbled messages or notes, some sketches. The sketches meant nothing to Medea, but Chesney instantly grabbed one and stared at it intensely.
What is this?
He said, definitely not calmly. He turned it around to Daphne and pointed to it.
Daphne, what is this? That,
she said,
is something Zagos is building. Right now.
The sketch slipped out of his fingers in shock. Medea picked it up to look at it more closely. She couldn't make heads or tails of it.
Chesney, what's wrong?
In a whisper, he managed.
That's what the inside of Dahlgren looked like.
A chill went down her spine.
What? What does that mean? Daphne, what's going on here? It means,
Daphne said soberly,
Zagos has been building a machine that is meant to imitate Dahlgren. He's... What?
Chesney shouted, standing and knocking his stool away.
How? That's impossible. Well, he's in the middle of building it right now, and by the reports I'm getting, it will be ready in a matter of weeks, maybe even days. He's even given it a fitting name. Noi Gren.
Chesney, still shocked into near paralysis, asks,
Is he insane? Doesn't he understand what he's doing? You're telling me that not only did he somehow come to understand the Reagan technology, but he's been building it for long enough that it's almost done.
Daphne agreed.
Is he insane? Clearly. But he aims to use Noah Gren to launch an assault on Nasquat and bring the whole world under his power.
Medea had a question.
Hold on. Is it even possible to use it like that? When Chesney used it, it created a rampaging monster. If he uses it, won't it just make another awful beast that would destroy Lennis even faster? To be honest, I have no idea. If Dahlgren has a manual, I haven't seen it. We don't even know why Dahlgren was built in the first place, or what purpose it was originally meant to serve. But if Zagos is building Noi Gren with plans to use it against Nasquat, I think it's safe to assume he has a strong understanding of its capabilities. There's no way he would build such a thing if he wasn't 100% sure he could use it and control it.
Chesney fixed Daphne with a serious expression.
Please tell me you have a plan. A plan that doesn't just hinge on Medea and me. That's enough with your theatrics, Chesney,
she said, crossing her arms and returning his gaze.
You already know that those 3 items are the only things capable of doing any harm to Kmat, Dahlgren, and Noi Gren. Only you can use them. It's not fair, but that's how it is. Now, There's a passage in this cave that leads under the ocean and straight back to Nasquat. Tomorrow, you two need to take it, and do everything in your power to destroy Noigren.
At the end of her rebuke, Daphne sighed once more, and she looked about at Hollow as a ghost.
Don't you think I feel awful laying this burden on you? That I don't know how unfair it is. But there is no one else. Do you understand? We could send an army of thousands to hack away at Dahlgren, and it wouldn't scratch the paint. Even if we had an army, which we don't, we'd be spotted instantly and taken out just as fast. The only plan we have is you two as a small infiltration team, hopefully being able to sneak into the Temple of Zagos and destroying it before it's completed.
At last she stood up, on wobbling legs.
Now, I want you two to get rested up for tomorrow. I need to lay down for a while.
And she staggered into a side passage, leaving the pair of them at the table. Eventually, Wild, Fast Joe, and Luliette cautiously approached. They had the look of frightened zookeepers approaching wild animals that had escaped their cages.
Joe, that was a lot,
Wild said, trying to joke. Meanwhile, Fast Joe retrieved Chadsney's chair and bade him to sit. He put a hand on the young man's shoulder.
I can't offer much, but I swear I will fight beside you as long as you have need of me. You're not alone in this.
This seemed to snap Chadsney out of the faraway look he'd been wearing. He looked at Fast Joe with a sense of confusion, and maybe a little awe.
Wait, after all that, you still want to go with us? Are you crazy? Ha! Maybe I am, but I didn't lie when I said I saw hope when I looked at you. And I don't think it's just the influence of this Regan blood or what have you. When I look at you both, I see fierce determination and an unwavering desire to help. That's what makes you two heroes. For real.
Wild joined, giving them her characteristic grin while she stretched her arms.
You two are like determination incarnate. If it had been me at the start, I'd probably have given up. But when I'm with you, it's just like, I get this feeling that as long as we keep moving forward, we're going to win this thing.
I wish I had the confidence you both have in us, Medea wondered to herself. Outwardly, she said,
That really means a lot. That you want to fight beside us. And that all this Regan stuff doesn't bother you. I'd be lying if I said I was over it all, but you both saying so gives me some hope, too.
Biting her lip, Luliette said,
I feel awful for interrupting, but I just wanted to say something, too. Chesney, Medea, I can't fight, but I want to help in any way I can. So, I'm going to cook us all a feast of favorites tonight. I want you two to tell me everything you've done, after, too. I feel like you're doing all this work for the world, and nobody knows about it. I want to change that. I don't know how I'll do it, yet, but I will find a way.
She bent over and gave them each a hug in turn, and then shooed them off to rest while she got to cooking. While Luliette and the other attendants worked, the team got off their feet and tried to rest without the world crushing them, just for a bit. Medea was mentally exhausted. It felt like the minstrel's tent was days ago, but it has only been that morning. So much had happened that it had no right to all have occurred in a single afternoon. Thinking about her past, her life, her heritage, it made her think of a question she hadn't given as much thought to as she should have. And thinking about it was a welcome change to all the massive revelations and wild emotional ride she'd undergone today. Where had she gotten the earth spirit from? She very clearly remembered awakening as a spiritualist using light. But when was the first time she had used earth? Earth on its own cured poison, and together with light, paralysis and confusion. When had she first used any of those spells? She closed her eyes, trying to think of all the times someone had been hurt back home, earlier and foggy recollections boiling up out of the confused mass of childhood memories. There! Just for a moment, she had a feeling of something. It was so indistinct it was barely a thought or memory, but more like the half-remembered bits that would give you déjà vu when you walked in the same room. A vague remembrance of trees. It was during the day. She remembered a tense feeling. Other children. But the more she tried to dredge up the memory, the harder it became, and eventually she growled her frustration and lay down on her back. To her surprise, Chesney was sitting beside her.
Hey, back with us, are you?
She jumped, and cursed colorfully.
How long have you been there?
He tilted his head and looked at her.
Well, I saw your face get all serious, so I came to check on you. I tried talking to you quietly, but figured I should just wait for you to notice when you didn't respond. You seemed like you were really focused. Oh. I'm sorry, Chesney. I didn't notice you at all. I was just reminded of my past, and it made me wonder about the Earth Spirit. Remember anything?
She shook her head. After a few heartbeats, he spoke again. When he spoke, his voice was warm, supporting, and joking.
Well, we already know I'm a mess, but how are you holding up?
She barked a laugh unconsciously.
Shattered. Absolutely in tatters,
she said, and returned the humor.
I know you're only half joking. And me too. But I've come to a conclusion I wanted to share that I think maybe you should hear too.
She brought up her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and looked at him expectantly.
I was just thinking about every crazy thing we've done, or fought for. All of the massive expectations that have come down on us. How many times we almost failed, and how miserable it's always felt. But then I remembered times that weren't miserable. You know what I mean, right?
She didn't know exactly where he was going with this, and nudged him.
Maybe. But go on. I was thinking about card games, eating good food, laughing together with everyone, telling stories at night before bed, the party at Ratzer, the dancers in Hagado, all the caves, even. They all had something in common.
He looked at her and smiled sheepishly.
You were there.
Her face flushed beet red involuntarily.
Well, what are you saying?
Chesney scratched the back of his head in that way he always did when he didn't know where to look or what to do.
I have no idea what I'm saying exactly. I just know that the only times I felt like a normal kid instead of all the rest of it was when it was you and me just having fun together. So, I figure, who cares? Who cares about all this big crazy stuff going on? All the big heavy things? Who cares what everyone wants from us? Let's just do it our way. Because it's what we want to do. Because otherwise, I think I'll just go crazy.
For a moment, she thought he was going to say something different, and her heart was going all over the place. There was still that shadow of a doubt about how she felt, sometimes, but then he would come and talk to her, and it was suddenly like it didn't matter anymore how real it was. It felt real. Wasn't that enough? The revelation was both a blessing and a curse. It was all well and good to feel a bit of clarity in her heart, but it was almost just as bad to feel these feelings and being unable to voice them. That aside, she rolled what he had said in her mind. Could they really be selfish enough to put everything else aside, and just journey together because that's what they wanted to do? To flip the world a couple of rude gestures and go their own way? She smiled and closed her eyes.
Now that you say it, I can't imagine wanting to do it any other way, Chesney.
She brought up her fist and pointed it in his direction.
Nasquat heroes?
He bumped it with his fist.
Nasquat heroes.
From across the room, Wild looked up, gasped, then called,
Hey! You can't do that without me. Not cool.
Medea smiled, winked an eye, and stuck out her tongue. Supper was extraordinary. Luliette and the other attendants had pulled out all the stops. Apparently, many of the magic school's best meals were on show, and Chesney and Luliette told Medea all about some more school stories that made her feel like she could almost see them herself. That, plus eating this food, made her feel like she got to attend the school just for a day. Daphne even joined them, eventually. She had a look on her face that made it seem like she was uncertain if she was even welcome, but Chesney extended a rope network by inviting her to eat with them and see what the cool kids were eating these days. After supper, Everyone either relaxed or just went to sleep. Chesney and Luliet started talking quietly in the corner. Medea had a hard time settling on doing anything. Reading was impossible. The cave was too close with everyone and everything, and all her thoughts couldn't help but spin and make it impossible to stop moving. She felt antsy, like she had to do something and didn't know what to do. She dragged out her journal. She'd barely looked at it this whole trip. It's not like she ever really used it as a diary. She was too scared someone might find it and read it. She sometimes doodled in it, or wrote down the lyrics to the songs she knew so she could remember later. Sometimes she even tried to come up with her own songs. Flipping through the pages was oddly nostalgic. Her pen hovered over the next blank page, but she couldn't write. She'd experienced so much in just a matter of weeks. There was a part of her almost screaming to write it down, tell the truth of it through lyrics even if no one else would ever hear them. Yet, at the same time, she wanted to keep everything to herself. She couldn't yet think of how she would want anyone else to know them. She slammed the book shut and stood up. Her legs wanted to move. After a bit of introspection, she realized what her body was aching for. She needed to fight something. Anything. It was like her body was expecting a fight at any moment and couldn't let go. When had that started? Looking back, she'd always been a bit of a fighter, and her job as protectress had needed her to be battle-ready all the time. But then Chesney came along, and suddenly every day was like a fight to the death. So what did it mean now that her body was always tense and waiting for a fight? Was it a problem? Would it get worse? Or is this just what it means to be a hero? The real question was, though, what was she going to do about it? Walking over to Chesney and Luliet, she waved.
Chesney, I'm going nuts. Will you spar with me?
The question stopped him mid-sentence. He opened his mouth with an expression that seemed like he was trying to think of something funny to say, then turned something between serious and confused.
You know, now that you mention it, I feel like I really need that too. My legs have been bouncing for hours like they can't stop moving, and I keep looking for stuff to play with in my hands.
He turned to Luliet.
Sorry for interrupting our conversation, but do you mind if I take a break for a bit?
Luliet, who had a blank book in front of her she'd been scribbling in, got a starry-eyed look and asked excitedly.
Not at all. But, can I watch? I think that would be amazing.
Chesney looked to Medea. She shrugged.
Fine by me. You can be our ref. Deal.
Luliet squealed. The trio marched outside into the cool of early evening. Still more than enough light to see by, though it probably wouldn't last long. Medea's heart pumped fast for just a moment, reminded of the brutal battle with the assassins the night before. Calm down. It's okay. It's over and done with. Everything is fine. Chesney took the short sword he had used prior to getting the sword of Cormu. He tossed Medea her sword staff.
Let's just avoid magic tonight and spar like this, okay?
She nodded and took her stance. Chesney took a different stance she'd never seen him use before. It took her a second to remember that it was one that the Guardian of the Helm had taken prior to them cutting him down. He's still trying to learn? Let's see how he does. She opened with a feinted slash, then a true thrust. The range of her staff was her main advantage, and she wasn't keen to lose it. He was caught off guard, and just dodged enough to avoid being cut in the side, then tried a leg sweep to throw her off balance. It didn't work. The battle started small. They took turns poking each other, moving out of the way with clumsy movements. When some of the hits started landing, it was almost like a wake-up call. Suddenly, their feet faster, eyes keener, blocks and blows turning into counter-strikes and a tug-of-war for spacing. Medea felt like she could see the battle unfolding steps ahead. This slash would force him here, then she'd block his counter, opening him up there. Always, though, he would surprise her at the last moment, and the dance would begin again. Their eyes were bright and their smiles wide as they danced under the night sky. Stars slowly awoke to watch their ballet of death. Their feet were like wings flying through the darkness, and their weapons like bells that rang of their joy. The darkness soon became almost total as twilight gave into true night. Still, they fought. almost preternaturally aware of each other's presence. But then, at last she slashed through empty space, and she looked into the darkness and saw something else in her heart. Cold, panting, and alone in the night, she suddenly felt that fear of the assassins once more. Her heart raced, her breathing became shallow and rapid. She turned this way and that, slashing at shadows. Chesney picked up on it immediately.
Nydia! What's wrong?
His voice was like a splash of warm water, and she bent over to catch her breath.
Yeah, it's just that fight before, with the assassins. The dark reminded me of it. I just had this sudden panic like one would just leap out of the dark again.
Chesney lit a fire in his palm and walked over. His mouth opened to respond, but then closed again. He planted his sword in the dirt and looked out into the night. He closed his eyes.
It must have been terrifying,
he said, after a time.
Ambushed in the dark. Your friends all knocked out. 2 trained killers at your throat. I honestly can't imagine. Yeah, I guess it affected me more than I thought.
He looked at her for a long moment, like he was trying to read her mind.
You kinda skimmed over everything before, but I didn't want to press you on it. You seemed really messed up. Do you want to talk about it?
She laughed softly through her nose.
Gods no, but I probably should.
She spoke haltingly about everything she had seen and done. She didn't gloss over this time the absolute despair she felt when she thought Chesney had died. How she had almost let them take her, but was saved at the last moment by Wilde, which cost her. And then the terror and rage-fueled battle that ensued where she was sure that she was only avenging their death.
I had to move so perfectly, and I was so terrified that a single blow could have killed me instantly, at the same time thinking how alone I was, and I was just so destroyed.
The next thing came out as a whisper.
I thought you were dead,
she continued.
But on top of that, I was ashamed. I think it was the shame, more than anything, that made me act, to at least try and fight to avenge you all. Without that, I probably could have just fallen beside you and let myself die.
A dozen heartbeats passed before he asked.
I can't think of anything to say that could make that better. I don't think anything like that even exists. So, instead, can I just hug you?
She just nodded. He carefully wrapped an arm over her and brought her in closer, holding her to his chest.
Just listen to my breathing for a bit, okay? I'm right here. I'm okay.
She nodded and listened. In and out, in and out. Slowly, she followed his breathing with her own. The lingering panic that had built slowly ebbed from her muscles. She grew quiet enough to hear the beating of his heart, and soon its rhythm made her tire.
So I'm thinking no more nighttime missions.
She snorted.
Yes, that's the lesson here. Well, I was thinking of sending Zagos a letter saying Assassins wasn't playing fair, but I wasn't sure what to put as the address. You're such a dork. Come on, I think I can finally sleep.
As they walked towards the entrance, they passed by Luliette, who was furiously writing in her book by the meager light escaping the cave mouth.
For the love of, I forgot you were even out here,
Chesney said, jumping in the air a little in surprise.
Why didn't you say anything?
Not even looking up, she said.
Sorry. Busy writing.
Nydia leaned over, trying to see what the woman had been scribbling, but Luliette angled the pages away.
No peeking.
Inwardly she groaned at the thought of someone else seeing that exchange between them, but at this late hour she was suddenly far too tired to care. The next morning came a little too soon. She'd had a rough sleep because of a nightmare, but she was also used to operating on almost no sleep, so she just grinned and bore it. During breakfast the next morning, they discussed in further detail what needed to be done.
All right, you two,
Daphne began, drinking her tea and nibbling on a piece of toast.
Everything I've seen so far points to Zagos building Noi Gran in the very heart of his empire, the Temple of Zagos. Hold on.
Wild piped in, mouth full of food.
You're telling me this guy built a temple to himself, and nobody laughed at him?
Chesney choked on his juice and had to spend a moment coughing into his elbow.
Yeah, it does sound a little over the top.
With a lilt in his voice that seemed to scream. I told you so. Festo gestured with his fork as he said.
Well, of course, anyone who did would find themselves very quickly building the very thing they despised, or sent off somewhere equally horrible. As I have mentioned, he is attempting to subtly rewrite not only his own history, but that of Lennis as well. I warn you, though, his believers are true believers who worship him as a god, and possibly for good reason.
Medea frowned a bit at that comment.
What do you mean by that?
He shrugged.
Only to say that perhaps he is the only one on this planet who was capable of harnessing the leftover technology of the Great Ones. He rebuilt Dagran in his own way. Driven, powerful, terrifying, and cruel. When faced with such a man, many will choose to worship instead of Dei. Yes, well, forgive me if I withhold my adoration to someone who tried to have a little girl kidnapped.
She grumbled, dabbing at her fried bulbrit.
Indeed.
Chesney cleared his throat again, then asked.
All right, so, he's building it at the Temple of Zagos. What do we know about it? And where is it? Well,
Daphne replied,
as a seat of power, it is a combination city, place of worship, and stronghold. No matter what, you're going to need to find a way to sneak in. He has a standing army he's building there. 2. Just waiting for the signal to invade Nasquat after Noe Gren is complete. As for where it is, let me see that map thing of yours.
Medea dug around in her pack and handed it over. Daphne pointed at the southwest corner Nasquat.
Here's where we are. When you go, there's a tunnel in here that leads all the way down to this spot.
She dragged her finger over the ocean until it landed on the northeasternmost part of Asquat.
Now, on the other side of the continent was Barsus, and just south of that was another island landmass.
She dragged her finger over to the northeastern part of Nasquat to point out where Barsus was, and then directly south over an expanse of water, tapping on another dot.
And this is where you'll find the temple. I'm guessing you're going to need some assistance somehow getting there.
Medea and Chesney leaned over and studied the map. The location where they would show up on Sayesquat was about as far as you could possibly get from their ultimate destination.
I don't suppose you have any more dragons we could take there?
Chesney joked, giving Daphne a look. She barked a laugh.
You already cleaned me out, troublemaker.
Wild leaned over and studied the map as well. She groaned, loudly.
So much walking. Can't we just take the boat or something?
Daphne shook her head.
Nope. It's not really ocean-worthy for starters, and you really don't want to retread any ground you've been on so far. I bet after your little stunts at Helm, and at the Throne of the Immortals, those players are crawling with agents. Actually, on that note, I had something to say.
Chesney said, standing. He looked to Medea.
Sorry I didn't bring this up with you, but, I've come to a decision, and I hope you'll support me on it. No, we can't just quit the mission and go fishing. Chesney.
He shook his head and tried to hide his smile.
Smart ass.
He cleared his throat and tried to be a leader again. Medea crossed her arms, leaned back, and listened.
Now that we are back in Nasquat, I think it's time we sent Wild home. What?
Wild jumped to her feet and slammed her palms on the table. It looked like she couldn't decide between being shocked and angry.
You're kicking me out just when it's getting cool.
Medea nodded along.
You're right, Chesney. I fully agree.
She could instantly see his reasoning. Wild shot Medea a desperate, hurt look.
Please, hold on. Wild. Listen to what he has to say. But, haven't I fought beside you all this time? Am I just not good enough, or something?
She looked plaintively between them.
What did I do? Wild.
He said.
Of course you're good enough. That's not the issue here. If you want to storm all the way up to Zagos' doorstep and punch him in the face, that's fine. But I also know that you have a family that, for weeks, has been worried sick about you and probably thinks you are dead. And right in the other room, there is a device that can send you an hour's walk from Lagan. But
Wilde stammered, struggling to form words and staring at her hands uselessly. This, Medea knew, was her time to step in. Softly, she stood and approached Wilde, and whispered in her ear,
Wilde, you've been incredible. But it's okay. It's okay to admit that you miss your family, that you miss your home. It's okay to want to stop.
Wilde squeezed her eyes shut, and a tear fell down one cheek. Her voice turned suddenly quiet.
Isn't that selfish of me, though? Everyone is risking their lives again, and I just get to go home?
Shh! Medea whispered, and hugged Wilde's shoulder.
You've done more for us than almost anyone, Wilde. And we know it's been really hard on you, too. You didn't ask for any of this. If anything happened to us all in Sasquatch, and we were separated, I'd never forgive myself. I already watched you die after you saved my life once. I just want you to be safe and happy again. Okay?
Wilde swallowed.
It's really okay. I can really go home?
Daphne added quietly.
Yes. Lagan is basically right through that passage over there.
At last, Wilde fully broke down.
I'm sorry. I know it's selfish. But I've been trying so hard not to be scared, and be brave for you, and act excited. But every night I dream that my old man is crying over my grave, and I'm standing there too, saying I'm sorry, but he can't hear me, and I miss everyone so much.
She couldn't hold anything back anymore, and she broke down into sobbing tears, grabbing Medea tight and crying into her shoulder. The height difference was a problem, but Medea didn't mind. She would much rather want her friend to be safe than to have a clean robe. She was going to have to wash it pretty good later, though. Over Wilde's shaking form, Medea spied a nonverbal exchange between Daphne and Chesney. She mouthed good boy to him, and he nodded solemnly. He, in turn, nodded to Medea. Thank you, he mouthed. Once Wilde recomposed herself enough, she said,
Okay, but promise me that if you need me, you'll come back to Lagan and get me, okay?
Chesney extended his hand.
It's a promise.
Wilde smiled wanly as she took it. The gratefulness in her eyes was so sincere. Medea slapped her hand over the shaking hands, saying,
Nasquat heroes forever.
With a big smile. Wilde crushed her back in a big hug. The next hour was a rush of preparations. Assembling packs, getting supplies, refilling bottles. For the longest time, she stood off on her own, staring at the crown in her hands. Her eyes lingered on the inscription on the inside rim. To my beloved Sophie. Her mind was oddly numb as she stared at it. This doesn't mean I forgive you for all this. She put the crown on her head, then made herself busy, but mostly just felt useless. That was until, in the middle of the bustle, she found Chesney struggling to put Cormu's armor on. His shaking fingers kept fumbling with the straps.
Hey. It's okay, I'll help.
This at least she could do. He jumped a little, and fumbled through a few words before he settled on a quiet,
Thanks.
With expert fingers, she started putting the straps in loops, and tightening them.
It's okay. Breathe. You are Chesney. You're right here.
His breathing shook.
I am Chesney. I am. Right here.
A few moments later, he was strapped in. She picked his helmet off the floor and stood in front of him. The way he looked at it.
Hey, you don't have to put it on. Any of it, okay?
She said, trying to get him to look into her eyes. Seeing him in pain like that made her stomach turn into knots. She wished so much she could be the one to wear this instead of him. Why was it so much easier for her to want to take on his burdens than taking on her own? She didn't know, but she did know she'd willingly take them both on for his sake. Long seconds passed that felt like a full minute before he took the helmet into his hands and pushed it onto his head.
No, I don't have to, but I will.
I'm so sorry, Chesney. She knew it. They both knew it. Neither of them really had a choice. Moments later, Luliette walked up to them. She looked between them both and was about to speak when she saw Chesney, gasped, and stammered,
"Oh my, by the great ones."
Medea stared daggers into Luliette and shook her head quickly and subtly. Luliette took the hint and backed up a step.
I just wanted to come and say goodbye. I want you two to watch out for each other and come back safe, okay?"
Luliette hesitated a moment, then hugged them both very fiercely.
"Please, really, come home safe, no matter what."
Soon after, they finally ventured into the cave that was meant to be a secret passage between Nasquat and Assasquat.
More bloody caves.
Medea sighed as they descended down another set of rough-hewn steps into darkness. The walls were moist and dripping here, and it felt like every few steps were covered in very slippery slime so that they always had to walk carefully.
"You know,"
Chesney said, leaning over to stage whisper into Fast Joe's ear,
"she likes to complain about caves, but the truth is she feels most at home in them."
A rock flew at his head, but a quick movement turned it into a total mist.
"That's so not fair. Okay, dodge this, smart ass."
She used the weakest possible arc of lightning she could and aimed it at his back, only for it to veer away and careen into a wall. They both stood still and looked at each other in shock.
"Did that just happen?"
Fast Joe leaned down and regarded the armor.
Perhaps this is another one of the amazing functions of Cormu's armor."
Medea grabbed her staff and swung at Chesney's chest. When she got very close, it was almost like a subtle force pushed her back, and she ended up giving him a glancing blow.
"Hey now, please stop trying to kill me." "Oh, shut up, you big baby. I'm experimenting."
She tried again, this time moving much slower and holding the staff much closer to the end. Trying to make it connect was like trying to push two magnets of the same polarity into each other. Next, she tried just punching it, but got the same feel of resistance. At last she gave up, and sighed.
"Okay, when do I get the super advanced magic armor?"
Fast Joe nodded, slightly bewildered.
"I'm right there with you. Well, I think we can safely keep Chesney in the front, at least."
She nodded.
"Agreed. And no complaining, at least until we find me a set."
He rolled his head. Since they couldn't see his eyes,
"I'll keep on the lookout."
They continued, mostly in silence, thought it wasn't forced or awkward. It felt so nice to just be able to walk and talk and not feel guilty about it for a change. Chesney had been right. It felt so much more right when they were just doing things their own way. The rest of the caves were utterly bizarre and alien. It was hard to notice at first with their lights, but during a break Medea had Chesney turn off his flame, and their eyes adjusted to see that the walls were covered in a glowing lichen. It was more than enough to see by, and so they did for the remainder of their journey. For days, they traveled in the hot, wet passages, at times narrow, and with others it was like staring into another great sea underground in caverns, so large even the lichen's light could not show. There was life down here, too. More than once they disturbed nests of rock-colored crabs that were amazingly fat. Additionally, some of their most annoying topside encounters seemed to be mirrored here. Whippers again, this time green, with their paralyzing touch, exploding rock monsters, and blind, disgusting venomous salamanders. Even though they were now 3 instead of 4, with their newfound power, confidence, and skill, the fights were always over quickly. After one such encounter, Medea spotted something amongst some rock. A set of bones that were now mostly just decomposed into dirt, but next to it a mostly pristine bough.
"Would you look at that?"
Chesney said, picking it up.
"Aside from being a bit dirty, It's like it's brand new.
It was indeed odd, though instantly it came to mind other certain artifacts that had the curious property of not degrading over the millennia. Medea took the bow, and then looked down at the remains. There wasn't even any armor or clothing. If there had been, it had long ago rotted away.
How long has this been down here, I wonder?
Splashing it in a nearby pool of water, she was able to remove most of the muck and pulled it over her shoulders. It was nice to have a bow in her hands again, and this one seemed strong. The path downwards had given way to mostly horizontal travel, and between all of the little skirmishes, they mostly fought boredom.
So, Neugren. Interesting timing, don't you think?
Medea said.
Oh yeah,
He said, nodding.
I'm done believing in coincidences. Someone tricks Duke into tricking me into going into the suddenly open Tower of Gabnid, turning it on, and now Zagos almost has a new one built? The only question is, when did Zagos start building it? Before, or after Dahlgren was activated? On that note, I hope the headmaster is okay. Still, it's incredible. Who could recreate that kind of technology in such a short time?
Fast Joe added grimly.
They don't call him the second coming of Gabnid for nothing. Ugh, I don't want to hear the word second coming ever again.
She growled, kicking a rock.
What's with the names, you think? What does Dahlgren or Neugren even mean? You're asking me. How would I know? It's probably some Regan word. Maybe Joanne would know. I'm sure whatever it means. Zagos thinks it's very clever.
Soon, the way began to slope upwards more than downwards. Then, the glowing lichens grew scarce, and they were forced to light their own way once more. Steps and steps, man-made and natural. It was impossible to tell how long they stayed underground, but not long after their third awakening, they found themselves in the colder air of Sasquatch. The air here was thick with fog. It gave the plains they saw sprawling before them have something of a ghost-like quality to them. Immediately their clothes started to get damp. Fast Joe sighed.
I see Misuda lives up to its name. I just didn't expect the whole valley to be this foggy. Misuda should be around here, somewhere, right next to a large body of water. Any idea where? Have you forgotten you have a map?
Chesney and Medea slapped their foreheads in unison, and she dragged it out of her pack. Sure enough, a few hours southeast was a glowing red dot. They started walking.
Oh, and watch out for the gross eye-bird,
Fast Joe added. She stuck out her tongue and arms gesticulated wildly in a shooing motion.
Blev, I don't even want to know what those are, but they are officially Chesney's job now. Agreed,
Fast Joe added, jovially. Chesney grumbled about being surrounded by wise guys.
This is going to be a long walk.